Princess Leora ran through the long crystal halls of the palace, her breath quick and shallow. Her soft slippers slid on the smooth floor, and her hands shook as she held the thin dagger close to her chest. Outside, loud booms echoed in the distance. The sky flashed red and silver through the tall windows. The air smelled like smoke and fear. She could hear shouts behind her. Guards loyal to her father were fighting hard, but the enemy was stronger. Her father's voice still rang in her ears from moments before, when he had grabbed her shoulders and said, "You must go. Do not stop. Do not look back. You are our only hope now." She had wanted to argue, but the doors of the throne room had burst open, and he had pushed her toward the secret passage. Now she ran through it, her long gown torn and dirty already. She reached the end of the passage, which opened onto a small landing pad hidden behind the palace. Her private shuttle stood ready, its engines humming faintly. Two of her father's guards waited there, holding weapons. When they saw her, one of them quickly ran forward. "Princess," he said, bowing his head, "we have little time. They are coming." She nodded, even though her legs felt weak. She forced herself to climb the ramp into the shuttle. She sank into the pilot's chair, gripping the controls with cold fingers. The two guards followed and stood behind her as the door closed. The shuttle lifted off smoothly, but as soon as it cleared the hidden canyon, bright beams of light streaked past them. Enemy ships were already in the air, chasing them. Leora's heart pounded as she steered the shuttle sharply to the right, trying to avoid the beams. One of the guards fired the shuttle's small cannons. The other guard stood at her side, watching. "The screens. There is a safe route through the western cliffs," he told her. "If you can make it there, you may lose them." She nodded and pushed the shuttle faster. The engines roared, and the small craft shook under the strain. She flew low over jagged rocks and through narrow canyons. Behind them, two enemy fighters followed closely. A sharp alarm blared inside the shuttle. The first guard shouted, "They have locked weapons on us." Before Leora could react, a blast of energy hit the back of the shuttle. The whole ship lurched forward. Sparks flew from the control panel. Smoke filled the cabin. She coughed and tried to keep control of the shuttle, but the controls were hot and unresponsive. "We are hit," the second guard said, gripping the edge of her chair. "You must eject, Princess. The ship will not last. And you," she asked, her voice cracking. The guard shook his head. "Our duty is to you. Please, you must survive." Lips trembling, she nodded. She pulled the emergency lever and felt the seat jerk backward. The guards both saluted her as the floor opened. Under her seat, the last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her, was the shuttle spinning and burning in the sky. The escape pod shot away from the shuttle and into the blackness of space. It spun wildly at first, then steadied. The pod's small engines glowed faintly as it drifted toward the edge of the system. Leora sat frozen in her seat, unable to speak, unable to cry. She stared at the stars through the small window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't know how long she floated there. Time seemed to lose meaning. She felt cold and heavy, her thoughts moving slowly. Her mind kept replaying the scene of her father shouting, the guards falling, the fire in the palace. Then another alarm began to beep in the pod. She looked at the screen and saw that the engines were failing. The pod was being pulled by the gravity of a nearby moon. She pressed buttons and tried to correct the course, but nothing worked. The pod shook harder and harder as it entered the moon's thin atmosphere outside the window. She could see the surface of the moon rushing up to meet her. It was covered in dust and rocks, grey and lifeless. She closed her eyes and held on. As the pod slammed into the ground with a loud crash, when she opened her eyes again, everything was quiet. The pod's lights flickered weakly. The air smelled of burned metal. She unbuckled herself and pushed the hatch open. The air outside was dry and cold. She stumbled out of the pod and onto the dusty ground. Sharp rocks dug into her feet through the thin soles of her slippers. She looked around. There was nothing but endless hills of grey dust and jagged stones under a pale sky. She took a few shaky steps away from the pod before falling to her knees. She felt dizzy and sick, her arms shaking as she tried to catch her breath. She looked back at the pod and saw that smoke was still rising from it. She forced herself to stand again. She could not stay here. She had to move, even though she had no idea where to go. She walked slowly, her gown dragging in the dust, her head bowed above her. The stars began to fade as the sun of the moon's system rose, casting long shadows over the ground. She kept walking, her eyes half closed, her body numb after what felt like hours. Her legs finally gave out. She fell to the ground and did not get up. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was a tall figure walking toward her from the distance. It was a silhouette, dark against the bright horizon. She could not tell if it was friend or foe. Her eyes closed, and she drifted into darkness, hoping that somehow she would wake up again. The figure walking toward Leora moved slowly but with purpose. The dust around him rose with each step, and his boots left clear marks in the grey ground. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at her. Ethan Cole had seen many strange things during his years as a soldier and mercenary, but this was different. Here, lying on the cold rock, was a woman unlike anyone he had ever met. Her skin had a faint shimmer to it, almost like crystal. Her gown, torn and dirty, still glowed faintly in the sunlight. Her long hair was tangled and full of dust, but it shone like silver. He knelt beside her and checked her pulse. She was alive but weak. Her breathing was shallow, and her hands were cold. He frowned and shook his head. "What kind of trouble? Did you get yourself into—" He muttered. He slid his arms under her and lifted her gently. She was lighter than he expected. She stirred faintly and whispered something in a language he didn't understand. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Ethan looked at the broken escape pod behind them. Smoke still curled up from its side. He glanced at the sky, scanning for other ships. Nothing. The area seemed quiet for now. He adjusted her weight in his arms and started walking toward the outpost. The outpost was small, just a few metal buildings surrounded by a thin fence. It was built into the side of a rocky hill to protect it from wind and storms. Ethan walked through the main gate and nodded at the man on watch duty. The guard raised an eyebrow when he saw the strange woman, but said nothing. Inside the main building, Ethan carried her into his quarters. The room was simple: a bed, a chair, a small table, and a locker in the corner. He laid her down on the bed and covered her with a blanket. He took off his gloves and reached for the medical kit on the table. He opened it and began cleaning the cuts on her arms and face. She winced slightly but did not wake. When he finished, he sat back and studied her. She was not human, that much was clear, but she was also not like any alien he had seen before. Her features were almost human, but too perfect, too bright. He sighed and rubbed his neck. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Of course, she did not answer. After a while, He got up and went to the outpost's small kitchen. He poured water into a bottle and grabbed some dry rations. When he returned to the room, she was still asleep. He set the food on the table and sat in the chair, leaning back with his arms crossed. A few hours later, she stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, and she blinked at the ceiling. Then her gaze shifted and landed on Ethan. She froze, her body tensing, under the blanket. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Easy, you're safe." She stared at him without speaking. Her eyes were a pale blue that almost glowed in the dim light. "Do you understand me?" Ethan asked. She hesitated, then nodded very slightly. Her voice was soft and hoarse when she spoke. Where am I?" "You're on a moon near the edge of human space," he said. "This is a mining outpost. I found you out there, near your wreck." She sat up slowly, wincing. She glanced around the room, then back at him. "Who are you?" "Ethan Cole," he said simply. "Just a man who works here." Her eyes narrowed. "Why did you help me?" He shrugged. "You needed it." She looked down at her hands, silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Thank you." Ethan nodded. "What's your name?" She looked up at him, her chin lifting slightly. "Leora," she said. "Leora," he repeated. "Well, Leora, you're lucky. Whatever hit you didn't finish the job, but you've got some bruises and cuts. You should rest." She shook her head. "I cannot rest." "They are coming." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Who's coming?" "The ones who destroyed my home," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. "They will not stop until I am dead." Ethan frowned. "So you're saying you've got enemies chasing you?" She nodded. "Yes, many." He leaned back in his chair. "Studying her? And what happens if they find you here?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "They will kill me, and anyone who helps me." Ethan let out a low whistle. "Sounds like you're more trouble than you look." Her cheeks flushed faintly, but she did not reply. Instead, she tried to swing her legs off the bed. Ethan stood and held up a hand. "Hey, you're in no shape to go anywhere. If you walk out there now, you'll collapse before you get 50 feet. "I must go," she said firmly. "And do what?" he asked. "You don't even know where you are. You don't know what's out there." The next morning, Leora woke to the sound of low voices outside the room. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling for a few moments, trying to remember where she was. Her body felt stiff and heavy, but at least the pain in her arms and legs was less sharp than before. She sat up slowly, glancing around. The room was quiet and dim. The bed was rough but warm, and the air smelled faintly of dust and metal. Her gown was still dirty and torn, but someone, probably Ethan, had cleaned most of the blood from her skin. She stood carefully, holding on to the wall for balance. After a moment, she walked to the small table and picked up the empty water bottle. She turned it in her hands, staring at her reflection in the shiny surface. She barely recognized herself. The door opened and Ethan stepped inside, holding a steaming cup of something. He stopped when he saw her standing and raised an eyebrow. "Look at you," he said. "Already on your feet. Not bad." She looked at him but said nothing. He set the cup on the table and leaned against the wall. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Good," he said. "Eat first, then we talk." He left the room again and returned a few minutes later with another packet of food. He handed it to her, and she sat at the table, opening it slowly. He watched her for a moment, then sat down across from her. They ate in silence. After she finished, She looked up at him. You said we would talk, she said softly. He nodded. Yeah, we need to figure out what happens next. I must leave, she said. It is not safe here. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. You said that yesterday, but you still haven't told me who's after you or why. She lowered her gaze and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My name is Leora of the Crystalborn. I was, heir to the throne of my people. My father was betrayed. His enemies killed him, and now they want me dead too. Ethan frowned. Crystalborn, never heard of them. She met his eyes. You would not. We have hidden from humans. For a long time. But now there is no hiding anymore. He studied her for a moment. So you're saying you're a princess? She nodded. He let out a low whistle. Well, that explains the attitude. Her cheeks flushed faintly, but she didn't reply. And these enemies of yours, he went on, how far would they go to find you? Anywhere, she said. They have ships, soldiers, hunters. They will find me, even here. He rubbed his chin, thinking, and if they find you here, they'll kill everyone who gets in their way. Yes, she said quietly. Ethan sighed. Great. She stood. Then, her hands clenched at her sides. That is why I must leave. I cannot stay here and bring danger to you and your people. Where would you go? He asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Thought. So, he said, you don't have a plan. She looked away. I will find a way. Listen, he said, leaning forward. If you walk out of here alone, you won't last a day. This moon is empty. No ships come by without reason. And those hunters of yours, they're probably already looking. She clenched her fists tighter. What choice do I have? He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the rocky hills beyond the fence. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows. Finally, he turned back to her. You let me help you, he said. Her eyes widened. Why? He gave a small shrug. Because I hate bullies. And because you clearly don't know how to survive out here. She studied him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, You do not know what you are offering. They will come for you too. He smiled faintly. Let them try. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she sat back down slowly. What is your plan? She asked. He grabbed a map from the locker and spread it on the table. There's an old comms tower on the far side of the hills, he said, pointing to a spot on the map. If we can get there, we can send a signal and maybe get a ship too. Pick you up, but it's not easy to reach. Rough ground, and we'll have to move at night to avoid being seen. She nodded. When do we leave? Tonight, he said. Get some rest. You'll need it. That evening, as the sun set, Ethan packed a small bag with food, water, and a few weapons. He handed her a jacket and a pair of boots. You'll freeze without these, he said. She took them and put them on quietly as they stepped out of the building. The air was cold and sharp. The sky was dark, full of stars. Ethan led the way through the gate and into the hills. The ground crunched under their boots, and the wind whipped dust around their legs. For a while, they walked in silence. Then Leora spoke softly. You have done this before, she said. What? He asked. Helped someone like me, she said. He shook his head. Not exactly, but I've been in a lot of fights, and I've seen too many people left behind. She glanced at him, her eyes thoughtful. You are different from what I expected. He gave a short laugh. Yeah, I get that a lot. They climbed higher into the hills, moving quickly but carefully. Sometimes they stopped and listened, checking the sky for any sign of ships. Once, they heard a faint hum in the distance and ducked behind a rock until it passed hours later. They reached a narrow canyon. Ethan stopped and crouched down, studying the ground. Tracks. He murmured "Lior" and knelt beside him and saw faint marks in the dust. They are close, she whispered. He nodded. Yeah, but we're faster. They moved on, but now Ethan kept one hand near his weapon. His eyes swept the shadows ahead of them, always watching, finally. They climbed to the top of a ridge and saw the faint outline of the Cums Tower in the distance. It stood tall and thin against the starry sky. There it is, he said quietly. But before they could take another step, a bright light flashed behind them. Down, Ethan shouted, pulling her to the ground. A blast of energy streaked past, hitting the rocks just ahead. Dust and shards flew everywhere. Ethan rolled to his feet, his weapon drawn. In the distance, dark shapes were moving toward them, fast and silent. Leora's heart raced as she scrambled behind a rock. She looked at Ethan, who stood firm, his eyes narrowed. "Looks like they found us," he said, his voice calm. She clenched her hands and whispered, "Then we fight." He glanced at her and gave a small, approving nod. "That's the spirit," he said. "Just stay close." As the hunters closed in, the two of them prepared to make their stand. The night was far from over. The hunters moved closer, their dark shapes sliding between the rocks like shadows. Their weapons glowed faintly in the starlight. Leora's breath came fast and shallow as she pressed herself against the cold stone. Ethan crouched beside her, his weapon ready. He looked at her and spoke softly. "We need to move. If we stay here, they'll surround us." She nodded, but stayed quiet. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes stayed fixed on the hunters. Ethan pointed to a narrow path that curved down the other side of the ridge. "We'll head that way. Stay low and follow me." He didn't wait for an answer. He darted forward, keeping his body close to the ground. Leora followed, her gown catching on the rocks as she moved. Behind them, the hunters opened fire. Beams of light shot past, striking the stones and sending sparks into the air. Dust filled Leora's lungs as she ran. Ethan stopped suddenly and grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a large boulder. He peeked out, then looked back at her. "They're faster than I thought," he whispered. "We need to slow them down." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small round device. He pressed a button, and it began to blink softly. He handed it to her. "When I say go, throw this behind us as far as you can," he said. She nodded. Holding the device tightly, he took a deep breath, then leaped out from behind the rock, firing at the hunters. The sudden attack made them scatter for cover. He shouted, "Now." She threw the device. It bounced once, then rolled into a crevice. A moment later, a bright flash lit up the canyon, and a wave of heat rolled over them. The hunters cried out and fell back, blinded for a few seconds. Ethan grabbed her hand. "Come on." They ran down the path, their feet sliding on loose stones. The Cums Tower grew larger in the distance, its thin metal frame shining faintly under the stars. When they reached the bottom of the ridge, Ethan stopped to catch his breath. He looked back. The hunters were moving again, but slower now. "That bought us some time," he said, "but not much." They started walking again, this time more carefully. The ground here was flatter, but the rocks cast long, dark shadows that could hide anything. Ethan kept his weapon ready, his eyes scanning every corner. After a while, Leora spoke softly. "You did not have to do this." He glanced at her. "What do you mean? Help me," she said. "Risk your life? Why?" He gave a small shrug. "Because someone has to." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You are different from the others I have met." He gave a short laugh. "Yeah, I get that a lot." They walked in silence for a few more minutes. Then she said, "You fight well." He smiled faintly. "So do you. You kept your head back there." She shook her head. "I was afraid. Everyone's afraid," he said. "The trick is to keep moving anyway." She thought about that and nodded slightly. Finally, they reached the base of the Cum's tower. It stood tall and silent, its metal legs planted deep in the rocky ground. The air was colder here, and the wind whistled through the frame. Ethan led her to a small door at the base. He pressed a button, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was stale but warmer. A faint light flickered on the ceiling. He pointed to a ladder that led up to the control room. "Up there," he said. She climbed first, her hands gripping the cold metal rungs. He followed right behind her. When they reached the top, the air was quiet now, except for the faint crackle of small fires and the sound of the wind. Dust hung in the air around them, glowing faintly under the stars. Leora and Ethan stood side by side, catching their breath after the fight. Lior lowered her weapon slowly and looked around. The hunters were gone, their dark shapes lying still on the ground or retreating back into the hills. Ethan crouched down by one of the fallen hunters and turned the body over. His eyes narrowed as he studied the strange armor and weapon. He shook his head and stood up again. "They'll send more," he said quietly. "These were just scouts." Leora nodded. She already knew her enemies would not stop. She felt it in her bones. She leaned back against a rock and closed her eyes for a moment. Her arms and legs ached, and her head felt heavy, but there was also a strange warmth inside her now, a feeling she could not explain. Ethan walked over and handed her a bottle of water. She opened her eyes and took it, drinking slowly. "You fought well," he said. She looked up at him. "So did you." He gave a small smile, but didn't say anything. Instead, he turned and walked toward the Cum's tower. Leora followed him inside. They climbed the ladder back to the control room. The screens were still glowing faintly, and the quiet hum of the signal filled the air. Ethan checked the console and nodded to himself. "Someone heard us," he said. "There's a ship coming." Leora's heart jumped at his words. "A ship?" "Yeah," he said. "But we don't know yet if it's friend or enemy. Could be anyone." She walked to the window and stared out at the sky. It was still dark, but a faint line of light was starting to appear on the horizon. Dawn was coming. She turned back to him. "What happens if it's them?" He leaned against the console and crossed his arms. "Then we fight again, same as before." She looked at him closely. There was no fear in his eyes, only calm. She wanted to ask him how he could be so steady, but she stayed quiet. After a while, she sat down on the floor and rested her head against the wall. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted into a light sleep. She dreamed of her home, the shining halls of crystal, her father's warm smile, the sound of the great bells ringing through the air. But then the dream shifted. The sky turned dark, and the palace burned. She heard shouting, felt herself running, and then nothing. She woke with a start, her heart racing. She looked around and saw Ethan sitting at the console, still watching. The screens. He noticed her and gave a small nod. "You're awake," he said. She stood and walked over to him. "How long?" "A couple of hours," he said. "The ship's closed now." "Won't be long." She stared at the screen, where a small blinking dot was moving closer. Then she noticed something. Around his neck, just under his shirt collar, a faint silver chain glinted in the light. She tilted her head slightly, curious. "What is that?" she asked. He looked confused for a second, then reached up and pulled the chain out. At the end of it was a small pendant, a crystal set in a circle of metal, glowing softly. "What?" Lyora froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling. Where did you get this?" she whispered. He looked down at it and frowned. "This, I've had it as long as I can remember. Found me with it when I was a baby, or so they say." "Why?" She stared at him, her eyes wide. She knew that pendant. She had seen it many times before, around the neck of her baby brother, who was taken away when she was very young. She took a step back, her mind spinning. "Your name," she said quietly. "What is your full name?" He hesitated. "Ethan." "Cole, at least. That's what they called me on Earth." She shook her head. "Not Ethan," she said softly. "Ilian. Your real name is Ilian." He stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath. "You are my brother," she said. "You were taken away as a baby, hidden on Earth to protect you from the same enemies who hunt me now. They told me you were lost forever. But it's you. It has to be." He blinked at her, his mouth slightly open. "What?" She stepped closer, her hands reaching out to touch the pendant. "This," she said, her voice shaking. "This is the royal emblem. Only one was ever made. It belonged to my brother, and now here it is." He looked down at the pendant, then back at her. His expression was unreadable. "You're saying I'm not human?" he asked finally. "You are human," she said. "But you are also crystal-born, like me. You are both." He backed away, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is crazy," he muttered. "You're saying I'm a prince?" "Yes," she said. "My brother, my real brother." He laughed faintly, but there was no humor in it. That's impossible. I don't remember any of that." "You were too young," she said gently. "You wouldn't remember." He sat down in the chair, staring at the floor. Leora watched him quietly, her own heart heavy with emotion. After a long silence, he finally looked up at her. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then what happens now?" She took a deep breath. "We take back what is ours," she said. Together he was quiet for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "Together, huh?" she nodded. He looked back down at the pendant and held it in his hand for a long time. Finally, he stood and met her gaze. "All right," he said. "Together." Outside, the faint hum of the approaching ship grew louder. They both turned to the window and watched as a small light appeared in the sky, growing brighter and closer. Ethan, or Elian, tightened his grip on the pendant and took a deep breath. Leora stood beside him, her heart beating fast, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The ship landed with a low rumble, dust swirling around its legs. The doors began to open. They exchanged one last glance. "Ready?" she asked softly. He nodded, "Ready." And together they stepped forward to meet their future. The ship's door opened slowly, and bright light poured out onto the rocky ground. Leora and Ethan stood still, waiting. The air was quiet except for the low hum of the engines. Dust swirled around their feet. Then a figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall, wearing a long cloak, and its face was hidden by a dark hood. Behind the figure, two more stepped out, carrying weapons but not raising them. Ethan moved slightly in front of Leora, his hand resting near his weapon. She touched his arm gently. "Wait," she whispered. The hooded figure stopped a few steps away from them and slowly pushed the hood back. Under the hood was a woman with sharp features and silver hair, her skin faintly glowing like Leora's. Her eyes were pale and serious. She looked at them both, then spoke in a calm voice. "Princess." "Leora," she said, and "Prince Elian, at last." Ethan blinked but stayed quiet. Leora stepped forward, her chin lifted. "You know us?" Leora asked. The woman gave a small nod. "I am Commander Celine of the Royal Guard. We have searched for you for many years. It is a miracle that you both stand here now." Leora's throat tightened. "My father." Commander Celine's eyes softened. She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, the king is gone. But his children live, and that means hope lives too." Ethan glanced at Leora, his jaw tight. She swallowed hard and stood straighter. "Why are you here?" she asked. Celine's expression grew serious again. "To bring you home," she said. "The people still loyal to the crown are gathering. They are ready to rise against the usurpers, but they need their rightful heirs." Ethan let out a small breath and muttered, "Heirs, right." Leora looked at him. "You are," she said firmly. He met her eyes, and after a long pause, he gave a faint nod. Celine motioned toward the ship. "Come, we cannot stay here. The hunters will send more. It is not safe." Ethan and Leora exchanged one last glance before stepping forward together. The two guards moved aside, and Celine led them into the ship. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of metal and smoke. The walls glowed with soft light. They followed Celine to a small room at the center of the ship, where a round table and several seats waited. "Sit," Celine said. They sat. Celine remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back. "We have a plan," she said, "but it will not be easy. The enemy has grown strong, and they control the capital. We have hidden forces scattered across the stars, waiting for the signal to strike. With you two to lead them, we have a chance." Ethan leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "What if we don't want to lead?" Selena's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then everything your father fought for dies with you, and your people remain in chains." Leora reached out and put her hand on his. "We must," she said softly. He looked at her, then at the pendant around his neck. Finally, he nodded. "Double quotes all right," he said. "What do we do first?" Celine gave a small approving smile. "First, we take you to the sanctuary. It is hidden deep in the Crystal Mountains. You will meet the council and prepare there." The ship lifted off smoothly, and they felt the ground fall away beneath them. Through the small window, they watched the moon shrink into the distance. Hours passed. Ethan sat quietly, staring out at the stars. Leora sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She glanced at him now and then, but did not speak. Finally, he broke the silence. "So, this is real, all of it?" She nodded. "Yes, it has always been real." He shook his head and gave a dry laugh. "Funny, all my life I thought I was just some kid nobody wanted, and now I'm a prince." Not just a prince, she said, my brother. He looked at her then, and for the first time there was a faint warmth in his eyes. Yeah, he said softly. Your brother. The ship slowed and began to descend. Outside, towering crystal peaks sparkled under a pale blue sky. Deep valleys full of light and color stretched between them. It was beautiful and strange all at once.